Hi friends, yesterday you started reading Dinosaur Detectives with Mrs. Walsh, and today we're going to continue reading. Yesterday you helped Miss Walsh identify this story as being nonfiction. We know that it's nonfiction because it's going to teach us real information about some dinosaur detectives. Today we're going to continue reading about skeletons and fossils, and we're going to meet some new geologists and paleontologists who have been impactful in teaching us about what we know about dinosaurs. Today we're going to read about a fossil hunter who made a huge discovery. So before we start reading, I want you to take a minute and think to yourself, when was there a time that you found something special? So you can share this with a parent or a sibling or someone who's at home with you, a time that you found something special. Today our big takeaway is we're going to be continuing to work on gisting. Gisting is something that we've done all year. Remember that a gist is just kind of a super short summary of the page. You want to think about the noun, the event, and the location. Some vocabulary words that we're going to see that you might not be familiar with is the word plump. To be plump is to be overweight. Rival. A rival is a person who someone tries to be better than. So if you think about football teams, like some teams are rivals, they try to beat the other teams. And an escort. An escort is a person or a group of people who travel with other people to protect them. So sometimes like celebrities have escorts that keep them protected from other people. I know that Miss Walsh talked to you about this yesterday, but this book is set up a little bit differently than stories we've read before. I'm going to read the part in the white in the middle first, and then I'm going to go out to the outsides, and those are called insets, and make sure I read those too. Those insets give us a lot of really good extra information or define words for us, so we have to make sure that we always read all parts of nonfiction books. The heading of this part of the story is called The Bone Hunters. My name is Matthew Randall, but all of my friends call me Maddie. Let me tell you about my young days out in America's Wild West. Back in 1868, I found work on the building of the Union Pacific Railroad. Laying those iron rails was hard work, and it was dangerous too. This was the homeland of the Sioux Indians who hated the railroads. Without the protection of the U.S. cavalry, we wouldn't have lasted very long. For months on end, we lived on fried buffalo steaks provided by our own hunter, Buffalo Bill Cody. One day, a group of strangers rode into our camp. There were about a dozen youngsters, led by an older fellow who was short and plump. "Good day," said the old man. "I am Professor Marsh of Yale University, and these are my students. We are on a bone hunting expedition." This struck me as an odd occupation, although I was too polite to say so. So if I think about that text I just read there in the white, I want to gist it. Remember, the gist is just a short summary. I would gist it as Marsh arrives in the West to hunt for fossils. But now what I'm going to make sure that I do is I'm going to go and I'm going to read the insets. I'm going to start up here in the left. It says, expeditions. In the 1870s, Othaniel Charles Marsh, living from 1831 to 1899, led his students on 4 fossil hunting expeditions in the West. Then I'm going to come down here. Railroad. In the 1860s, the Union Pacific Railroad was built across the USA to link the cities in the east to the west. Coming over here. Buffalo Bill. They mentioned Buffalo Bill in the white part here. William Cody earned his nickname by supplying the railroad workers with buffalo meat. He was famous for his skill as a scout. And then lastly, I'm going to come right here and read this last part of the inset. Sioux. The Sioux depended on buffalo for food, clothes, tools, and tents. The settlers and railroad ruined Sioux hunting grounds. So the insets on the side kind of give extra information to what we read about in the middle. So I'm always going to read the middle first, and then these insets on the side help me learn a little bit of extra information. The professor had come to our camp to meet up with Buffalo Bill, who had offered to be his guide on the bone hunting expedition. Next morning, the bone hunters rode off. Buffalo Bill led the way, and Marsh rode beside him. They had an escort of cavalrymen and 6 wagons. We wished them well, and then went back to our work on the railroad. More than a month later, we met up with the professor again. His students now looked like real Westerners, with tanned faces and well-worn clothing. Marsh was full of stories of his adventure. He said that he'd shot an angry bull buffalo, which was charging at him. He'd also made friends with some Sioux who called him Big Bone Chief. Then he showed us the wagon loads full of bones he'd collected. He handed one of them around. "Here's a real treasure," he said. "It's a bird's skull, with teeth in its beak. This shows that birds must have evolved from reptiles. It proves that Darwin was right about evolution." We had no idea what he was talking about. Now I'm going to go to the insets. Museum. Marsh was the nephew of millionaire banker George Peabody. He used his uncle's money to build the Peabody Museum at Yale to house his fossils. Coming down here. Darwin. In 1859, Charles Darwin suggested that animals are not fixed in one permanent form or species. They change over time to produce new species. He called this evolution. Birds with teeth. Darwin's followers believed that one group of dinosaurs grew feathers and took to the air. They evolved into birds. Early birds kept some reptile features such as teeth. And this last part of the inset down here. Darwin's supporters hoped to find fossils that would prove his theory. This was why Marsh was excited to find a bird's skull with teeth. So, was Marsh's expedition successful, and how do we know? We know that Marsh's expedition was successful because it says he came back with wagon loads full of bones. So we know he found lots and lots of bones while he was on his expedition. We also know because of the inset at the top left that he found so many bones and fossils that he was actually able to create a museum. So we know he had to have so many bones and fossils. The professor said that if we ever found any strange bones, we should write to him at Yale. Then he went home with his students and his collection of bones. I guess that was the last time I would hear of bone hunting. Over the next years, big changes came to the West. The railroads I helped to build brought thousands of settlers from the East. New towns sprang up all over the place. In 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills in Sioux territory. Soon, we had a real gold rush, with trainloads of Easterners arriving, all hoping to strike it rich. The Sioux fought to defend their land, but were forced to move to reservations. I'd found a job looking after the train depot at a little place called Camel Bluff in Wyoming. I had plenty of free time, and I'd often walk up into the hills. There wasn't much to look at there, just a lot of dry, bare rocks. But one day in 1877, I found a bone sticking out of one of the rocks that was bigger than I was. Nearby, there was another huge bone, and another. These bones seemed to go on for miles. So if I'm gisting that part there in the middle in the white boxes, I would say that Matthew found miles and miles of bones while he was in Wyoming. But now I need to go make sure I read those parts on the insets. So follow along as I do that. I'm going to start over here. This says, headdress. The Sioux warriors wore eagle feather headdresses. And this is right above it is an illustration of what a headdress looks like. Next, I'm down here. It says Black Hills. The Sioux fought for the Black Hills. They won a victory at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1877, but eventually they lost their territory. Over here, this is about teepees. Before they were forced to stay on reservations, the Sioux made good use of portable homes called teepees. These were made of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles. And then the last part of the inset here says bare rocks. The rocky hills of Wyoming have been worn away by rivers, rain, and wind. These areas, called badlands, are wonderful places to find fossils. So why did the author include an illustration above the description of the teepee? So we know the description of the teepee was right here. And we're wondering, why did they add an illustration? They probably added an illustration so that we could know exactly what a teepee looked like. They told us that a teepee is kind of like a portable home where they slept, and this just kind of shows us what it looks like. I was going to send a letter to Marsh, but then I heard about a rich bone hunting professor that had arrived in Cannon City not far away. I traveled there expecting to find Marsh, but I was surprised to see a different fellow. He said that his name was Edward Drinker Cope. I asked him if he knew Marsh. "Marsh!" shouted Cope, turning red in the face. "That man is a fraud and a thief." It seems that Cope hated Marsh worse than poison. When I told him about the bones I had found, he offered me $100. So if I'm gisting just that white part on the left, I would say that Maddie finds another bone hunter named Cope. Now I'm going to continue reading over here on the white. I had to show him the place and keep it a secret from Marsh's spies. Cope soon had a team of diggers at work blasting the rock with gunpowder and prying the bones out with crowbars. Many bones shattered and were thrown away, but Cope couldn't keep his secret forever. One day, a team of Marsh's diggers showed up. It was just like the days of the gold rush, only these fellows were after bones. So I'm going to start with the first inset. So this is a photograph of Cope, and his name was Edward Drinker Cope. He lived from 1840 to 1897, and he wrote over 1,400 books and articles and named more than 1,000 new animal species. This next part here is about spies. So both Marsh and Cope hired spies to keep an eye on what the other one was doing. They also used bribes to win over diggers from the rival teams. And then over here, I'm going to read this. Ooh, I'm going to erase that real quick. Over here, I'm going to read all of this together. So it says broken bones. Eventually, the diggers invented ways to protect the bones they dug up. Marsh's men wrapped them in strips of cloth soaked in flour and water. Cope's men used boiled rice instead of flour. Useful techniques. The practice of wrapping fossils in cloth and plaster of Paris is still used on some digs today. So what did we learn from the side insets here on the right about how bones are protected? We know that bones are protected by using either strips of cloth or rice to protect the bones. It kind of keeps them in their specific shape. The Great Bone Rush. Cope and Marsh each had teams of diggers working all over the West. It was a race to describe and name the new species. As a result of this bone rush, they discovered almost 130 new kinds of dinosaurs. Cope worked alone, but Marsh had a team of expert assistants to help him put the skeletons together. Marsh's dinosaurs came in many shapes and sizes. There was the flesh-eating Allosaurus, meaning different reptile, and gigantic plant eaters like the Barosaurus, or the heavy reptile. There were also dinosaurs with horns, such as the Triceratops, meaning the three-horned face. The strangest dinosaur of all was one Marsh called Stegosaurus, meaning the roofed reptile. It had rows of mysterious bony plates all along its back. Meanwhile, Cope and Marsh attacked each other in newspaper articles. Their squabbling made both of them look silly, but it also made dinosaur a household word. So I'm going to start with the inset on the left, and then I'll move over to the inset on the right. Feud. Marsh and Cope fell out when Marsh pointed out that Cope had reconstructed a sea reptile with its head on the end of its tail. This humiliated Cope, who never forgave Marsh. Heavy reptile. Barosaurus belonged to the sauropod fossil family of dinosaurs, which were the largest animals ever to walk on the earth. Now I'm going over to the right side of the page in the inset. The roofed reptile. Scientists still argue about what the Stegosaurus used its plates for. Some think that it helped the animal control its temperature. Others believe that they were used to signal to other dinosaurs. So what did we learn about Cope and Marsh's interactions and relationship on these pages? We know that Cope and Marsh were rivals, meaning that they were trying to compete against one another. We know that they both did unkind things to each other, like attack each other in the newspapers. But we do also know that both of them became very successful and famous because of their feud and because of all of their findings of new dinosaurs. So what I want you to do now is to tell me what you learned about dinosaur detectives today. All you need to do is just leave a comment below with one new thing that you learned about one of our dinosaur detectives today, and then join us back on Friday for the rest of the book.